On the morning of Thursday, September 16, 2010, Susie Flanagan called the office of her husband Greg. Greg worked in the oil industry as a landman, easing the exploitation of mineral rights on private property for gas and oil companies. Although he lived in a small Texan city east of Houston, every Monday morning he would make the 2-hour drive in his pickup from Lafayette, Louisiana, west to a big ConocoPhillips refinery in Lake Charles. The night before, on Wednesday, September the 15th, Greg had checked into the hotel, the Hotel Elegante in Beaumont, Texas, and gotten comfortable as he had done countless nights before. He cranked up the AC, it's always super hot and humid in Texas in September, laid down on the bed, and with his BlackBerry cigarette pack, lighter, a candy bar, and a TV remote by his side, began watching Iron Man 2. But then something happened. Moments later, Greg was laying on the floor in front of the bed, face down, and with a cigarette between his fingers. He was dead. And the next morning, when his wife Susie called Greg's office, as she did every single day, there was no answer. Susie found it odd and contacted a couple of his co-workers and asked them to pay a visit to the hotel. The co-workers arrived at the door, but it was locked, so they asked the hotel staff to come out and open the door. A hotel employee arrived and opened the door for them. Once the co-workers entered, they were met with a frightening sight. Greg was lying on the floor, motionless, face down in front of his bed. He was dead. The co-workers frantically called the Beaumont Police Department. Soon the police arrived. The lead detective, Scott Apple, began looking at the crime scene. Scott Apple is your stereotypical cop. He loves being a cop. His wife is a cop, whom he met on the job. He loved working long and hard hours to solve even the toughest cases and put bad guys away in prison. For someone who loves his work so much that he didn't even consider it to be work, there was absolutely nothing to interest him. There didn't seem to be any break-in. The body didn't have any visible signs of a struggle. No blood or obvious wounds. Nothing disturbed in the room. Greg's wallet had a stack of $100 bills in it. So robbery wasn't much of an issue. The neighbors didn't hear anything. It was as though he just dropped dead, physically. Detective Apple's first instinct was that perhaps Greg had a heart attack. Although he didn't find any pills on him, he studied Greg's medical history, but ultimately did not find anything out of the ordinary. Sure, Greg wasn't an athlete and definitely didn't maintain a healthy living lifestyle. He smoked, didn't eat the healthiest food, but overall wasn't in a particularly bad shape for a 55-year-old. Overall, it was a theory worth pursuing, and Susie definitely found the possibility not unlikely. Perhaps Greg's day had come, an open and shut case, the detective thought. Greg's body was transported to a Jefferson County medical examiner for an autopsy. The coroner, Dr. Tommy Brown, examined the body and found internal damage, with some of the intestines ripped out. This was interesting, he thought to himself. His sac was also swollen and discolored, and around the wound was a small amount of edema fluid. The bruising had spread up the groin area and across the right hip. Something had hit him hard. The story his body told grew more intriguing. When Dr. Brown opened the front of the torso, he discovered a surprising amount of blood and extensive internal damage. A certain amount of partly digested food had been torn from his intestines. The doctor found small lacerations there, and on the stomach and liver, as well as 2 broken ribs and a hole in the right atrium of his heart. At this point, instead of natural causes, the coroner marked the homicide as the cause of death. When the coroner called the detective to report his findings, he was shocked and confused. He had mentioned that the type of injuries he noticed with Greg, he mostly witnessed in crash victims or in someone found under a heavy object. It was as though Greg had been hit by something very hard. Either something had fallen on him, or this was a result of an altercation with another person or persons. The fact that this was now ruled a homicide and not death from natural causes changed everything. That meant Greg was killed by someone else, but who? As a detective who loved the true crime mystery, this case had piqued Apple's interest. Beaumont had been a very safe city, and while there were murders in Beaumont, most had not been mysterious. Usually it was fairly clear how the person had died and who was responsible. Most were routine, open and shut cases. This one was different. Very, very different. The main problem was that nothing about the crime scene suggested a homicide. Things just didn't add up. The room was undisturbed and nothing was out of place. It was almost impossible that something could have fallen on Greg. There were also no signs of anyone entering the room and causing this crime. Robbery was quickly ruled out because Greg's wallet was flush with $100 bills. Furthermore, Greg's outer body showed no signs of beating. His torso didn't have any marks. Detective Apple was stunned. In his long career, he'd never witnessed a case such as this. 6 months into his work, he'd reached a dead end. Along with the lack of evidence in the hotel room, there were also a lack of motive. Who could have done it? Who didn't like Greg? Who wanted Greg dead? Greg was your quintessential nice guy. He didn't have any enemies. He really didn't have anyone who could have wanted him dead. There was his wife, which the investigators usually look into when trying to solve a homicide. But she couldn't have done it. Greg and Susie had married not once but twice. The first time they met and got married, Susie was in her 20s. But that didn't work out. Some years later, Susie called Greg out of the blue and Greg knew immediately what it meant. They got married again and had been married for 15 years at the time of his death. She considered him the love of her life, and nobody thought she had anything to do with his homicide. Then there was the electrician who came into Greg's room to fix the power outage. Minutes before, Greg killed the power in his room and the adjacent rooms when he tried to cook ready-to-eat popcorn in a microwave. Could it have been possible that this man had anything to do with the murder? The electrician did have a reputation as a sex offender, but when the police looked into it, they didn't believe he had anything to do with the case and let him go. Then, there were a group of union electricians staying in a room adjacent to Greg's, room 349. They were from out of town and were in Texas for an extended stay to get some work done for an oil company. They were the rowdy types, preferring to drink either at the bar in the lobby or in their own room. Could they have anything to do with Greg's murder? Perhaps when they realized that Greg killed the electricity, they decided to pay Greg a visit. Or maybe they had gotten drunk with Greg at the hotel bar and then got into an altercation with him later on that night. But when the detectives went over to interview them, they seemed genuinely friendly and courteous. They all denied having any interaction with Greg. They were even curious, asking detectives, "So what really happened to that guy?" All in all, everyone who might have at least have something to do with the murder, even remotely, was interviewed and crossed off the list. The case had become truly cold by this point. Feeling that the investigation had stalled, Susie decided to hire a prominent private investigator to take another look at this case. She had heard about this private investigator from a young lawyer friend. This lawyer, in turn, had heard about him from an article written back in 2005 where this PI solved a case that stumped police detectives. And he solved it by picking up on a small detail that escaped even the most seasoned police detectives. This seemingly minor clue led him directly to the suspect, who would be convicted down the road. Ken Brennan was born in Long Island, New York, and had served in the police department there for many years, and then became a DEA agent, where he had worked for 8 years. After that, he returned and moved down to Florida, where he continued to solve even the toughest cases as a PI. That afternoon, he picked up Susie's call on the very first ring. Susie mentioned how surprised she was that she was even able to reach him so easily, but Brennan immediately skipped the small talk and went straight to business. Susie described the case to him, and Brennan told her that he'd think about it and get back to her later. The fact that Brennan had a reputation as someone who could solve even the toughest cases meant that he could easily pick the cases that interested him. Brennan thought over the case and in the end decided that he would take it. The case appealed to him mainly because of the mystery and because there were so many avenues to explore that might crack the case wide open. Greg's family and co-workers, the maintenance workers, the electricians in the room adjacent to Greg's, other hotel guests, etc., etc. As always with any homicide, it's the people who are the closest that are looked at first, since there's a good possibility they might have had something to do with the murder. The first thing that Brennan did was visit Lafayette, Louisiana and talk to Susie. He grilled her with lots and lots of questions having to do with their relationship, possible infidelities, life insurances, and things like that. But there was nothing to suggest that Susie had anything to do with it. Susie and Greg seemed to have a truly loving marriage. Satisfied with Susie's answers, Brennan asked her if she had any idea who might have done it, and if there's anything strange or out of the ordinary she may have noticed in his hotel room. Susie recalled that Greg's room was very warm when the co-workers had entered it the following morning. Greg loved his room cool, and one of the very first things he did when he checked into a hotel was to crank up the AC. The next thing Brennan did was make arrangements for a trip to Beaumont, Texas. There he met up with the lead detective on the case and laid out how they're going to be working on it. Over lunch at a sports bar, he told him they're going to be working strictly as a team and that there won't be anything he'll be keeping in secret from the detective. And he'd expect the detective to do the same. Brennan assured him that it's still his case, and even if he would solve it, the detective will get all the credit. The detective agreed. The following morning, Brennan picked up Apple and they both headed to the Hotel Elegante. Once they arrived, Apple showed them crime scene photos and autopsy reports. Brennan looked over the photos and exclaimed that he might know exactly what had happened that night and how Greg had died. But first, he had to call his wife Susie. When Susie answered the phone, he immediately asked if Greg had been right-handed or left-handed. Susie answered that Greg had been right-handed. He then asked which hand did he hold the cigarette when he smoked. She told him it was the right hand. But when Greg was discovered lying on the floor, the cigarette had been in his left hand. To Brennan, that meant a couple of things. First, there was no way that Greg was beaten up or otherwise murdered somewhere else and then his body brought back to the hotel room. Whoever had killed Greg wouldn't have bothered placing that cigarette perfectly between his fingers. There wasn't any point to it. That meant that Greg had done it himself, and that also meant that he died just after putting that cigarette in his left hand. The second clue explained why Greg had been holding that cigarette in his left hand when he usually smoked in his right hand. He had switched over the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand because he was heading to the door and was about to grab the door handle with his right hand. In other words, something had happened to him, and as he was about to head out the door to seek help, he fell on the floor and died. The jigsaw puzzle was slowly coming together, But there were still a lot of unanswered facts. What did Greg die from and who did it? Although Brennan felt he was close to cracking the puzzle, he still felt he had a couple of pieces that didn't quite fit. What was evident at that point was that Greg wasn't beaten up in his room or elsewhere, but was merely minding his own business when he died. That naturally led him to the electricians that had been closest to Greg when he dropped on the floor. Brennan asked if they were questioned, and Detective Apple said that yes, they were, but there was nothing suspicious about them. Moreover, they seemed very open and friendly and had no idea a man had died right next door. But Brennan felt they knew more than they were willing to share. Months later, Brennan returned to Beaumont, and he and Apple went to talk to some of the electricians that had not been interviewed. By this time, it had been many months since they last spoke to them. They interviewed them again, but once again, this had uncovered nothing. But Brennan knew it had been worthwhile. During one of the interviews, Brennan recalled that one of the electricians mentioned that a gun had gone off in the hotel. Although Apple had said this was from another case and that Brennan was confused, Brennan still felt he was onto something. As soon as they finished interviewing the electrician, Brennan told Apple that they need to go back to the hotel. Apple, seemingly annoyed at this point, asked why. They had recently checked out the room and the detective saw no reason to return back there. But Brennan was adamant. "We are going to look for a bullet," he said. Once back at the hotel room, the pair began inspecting the floor, walls, furniture, everything. They found nothing. Brennan was frustrated because his gut told him that a gun was involved. They were about to give up when they suddenly noticed a small indentation right where the door handle met the wall. Although it appeared the small indentation was the result of a door handle hitting the wall, when they aligned the door handle and the wall, it didn't quite line up. So they went over to the adjacent room and checked that wall. And what do you know, the indentations had lined up perfectly. They removed a filler that was stuck in the hole, which appeared to be dry toothpaste, and shined a laser pointer through the hole. And immediately, it was obvious that Greg had been shot from the other room. Greg was assassinated as he was lying on the bed, watching TV, smoking a cigarette, and eating candy. The next step was getting the coroner, Dr. Brown, to admit that and put it into his report. Initially, Dr. Brown was not convinced. He was a man who'd been doing autopsies for many years, and there would be no way he changed his mind because some private investigator wanted him to. But Brennan insisted. He showed him various photographs taken at the crime scene, as well as those from the autopsy, and in one of those photographs, it was fairly clear that a bullet had been there. Dr. Brown looked closer at the photograph and finally admitted that yes, that might be where the bullet had hit. The main coroner was shocked that he was so careless and had allowed such a crucial error. Now that they knew how Greg had been killed and they knew who killed him, Brennan and Detective Apple traveled to Wisconsin to interview the electricians to hopefully secure the confession and learn the whole story of what happened that fateful night. They began by interviewing Tim Steinmetz at the Chippewa County Sheriff's Department. Tim was one of the electricians who was at the adjacent room the night Greg had died. They asked him if he had heard the guy who died next door. He admitted he may have heard about some guy dying, but was super light on details. At this point, they were pushing him to confess to what exactly had happened, but knew he wasn't telling the entire truth and may have been even covering for someone else. So they asked him to write down everything that had happened as a police statement. Once he was done, he asked him if he could leave, and then they dropped the bombshell. "You were free to leave before," Brennan said, "but now you have a problem." Upon asking what was the problem, Brennan told them that he just lied on an official police statement. They now told him that they knew exactly what had happened that night, and so if he didn't want any more issues, he should just come clean and tell them what exactly happened in that room that night. And then they finally learned the truth about what exactly happened. That night, the group of electricians were hanging out and drinking in one of the rooms which was adjacent to Greg's. Later on, one of the guys asked a coworker to go down and fetch whiskey from his car and also bring his 9mm Ruger pistol. When his coworker returned with the goods, Lance Mueller, who owned the gun, began joking around and playing with it. He pointed at one of the guys who ducked, and then suddenly the gun went off. It didn't hit anyone in the room. All they saw was a hole in the wall behind them. Eventually, they learned that someone in the room next to them had died, but they made no effort of finding out who it was or telling the police that their gun had got off and a bullet went through the wall. On October 29, 2012, more than 2 years after Greg was killed by a stray bullet, Lance Mueller faced a judge in Texas. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in jail. Had he come clean to the police right away, it's very likely he wouldn't have gotten more than a slap on the wrist.